If you discovered 12 different bullet wound scars, bomb fragments in a hip bone, and trauma marks that only appear in war zones on an ordinary-looking elderly man's X-ray, what would you think happened in his past? 2 weeks ago, Robert Martinez arrived at the emergency room with what seemed like a simple fall. And his story began exactly like this. Welcome to Untold Legends Stories. Before we uncover this mystery of hidden scars and forgotten valor, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered. Hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who carry untold histories. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with its usual controlled chaos on that Tuesday evening in October. Nurses moved between curtained areas with practiced efficiency. Doctors reviewed charts between urgent cases, and the constant hum of medical equipment created a soundtrack of healing that never stopped. It was 7:43 p.m. when Robert Martinez was wheeled through the automatic doors, and to everyone present, he looked like exactly what his paperwork said, an 80-year-old man who'd taken a fall at home. Dr. Sarah Chen had seen thousands of similar cases during her 5 years in emergency medicine. Elderly patients, usually alone, usually apologetic about bothering anyone, usually insisting they were fine despite obvious injuries. Robert fit the pattern perfectly as he was transferred from the ambulance gurney to the examination bed in Trauma Bay 3. He was conscious, alert, and remarkably calm for someone who'd reportedly fallen down a full flight of stairs. "Mr. Martinez," Dr. Chen said, reviewing the paramedic's report, "I see you took quite a tumble. Can you tell me what happened?" Robert's response was typical of patients his age, understated and almost dismissive. He'd been reaching for something on a high shelf, lost his balance, and fell. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth all this fuss. His neighbor had found him an hour later and insisted on calling an ambulance despite his protests that he was perfectly fine. What struck Dr. Chen immediately was Robert's composure. Most elderly fall victims arrived anxious, disoriented, or in considerable pain. Robert seemed almost comfortable in the clinical environment. He answered questions with military precision, provided exact times and details when asked, and never once complained about discomfort despite obvious bruising on his left side. The initial examination revealed what appeared to be standard fall injuries. Probable bruised ribs, a possible hairline fracture in the left hip, and various contusions consistent with tumbling downstairs. Robert's vital signs were remarkably stable for his age, his reflexes sharp, and his mental state completely clear. Dr. Chen ordered routine X-rays to rule out serious fractures and expected to send him home with pain medication and instructions to follow up with his primary care physician. The first hint that something wasn't ordinary came when the radiology technician took longer than usual with the images. Then longer still. What should have been a routine 5-minute review stretched to 15 minutes, then 20. Dr. Chen was reviewing another patient's chart when her pager buzzed with an urgent message from radiology. "Need you to look at Martinez X-rays immediately. Something very unusual. Can't explain what I'm seeing." Dr. Chen made her way to the radiology department expecting to see a complex fracture or perhaps an indication of a more serious fall than initially reported. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found when she walked into the viewing room. What if you were a doctor, expecting to see simple fall injuries, and instead discovered an X-ray that looked like a museum of warfare embedded in human bone? What if every image revealed more impossibilities, more questions that had no logical answers? The X-ray images displayed on the lightboard showed Robert Martinez's skeletal system in stark black and white detail, but scattered throughout the images like a constellation of metallic death, were dozens of foreign objects that defied medical explanation. Small, dense fragments were embedded in his ribs, his shoulder blade, his left femur. Larger pieces sat millimeters from his spine, so close to vital structures that their presence should have killed him decades ago. This wasn't an elderly man's skeleton. This was a battlefield map written in metal and bone. "Are you seeing this correctly?" Dr. Chen asked Tom Rodriguez, the senior radiology technician who'd called her down, her voice barely concealing her shock. "I've been doing this for 15 years, Tom replied, his hands actually trembling as he pointed to various areas on the images. "Doctor, I've never seen anything like this outside of combat casualty textbooks. These are bullet fragments, multiple calibers, different entry angles, different time periods based on the bone remodeling around them. And this," he indicated a larger, irregularly shaped object lodged in Robert's hip. "This looks like shrapnel from an explosive device. Grenade, maybe IED, maybe something bigger." But what stunned Dr. Chen into complete silence was the realization that came next. What if the man sleeping peacefully in Trauma Bay 3 had survived injuries that would have killed an entire platoon? What if his calm demeanor wasn't the result of medication, but the composure of someone who had faced death so many times that a hospital emergency room felt like a vacation? Dr. Chen studied the images more carefully. The metal fragments weren't random. They told a story of systematic violence over an extended period. Some were old enough that bone had grown around them, indicating injuries from decades ago. Others showed the characteristic scatter pattern of explosive devices. The man sleeping quietly in Trauma Bay 3 carried a catalogue of warfare in his skeleton. "Has anyone asked him about military service?" Tom wondered aloud. Dr. Chen shook her head. Robert's intake form listed his occupation as retired, with no mention of military background. His emergency contact was a neighbor, not family. His insurance was standard Medicare. Everything about his paperwork suggested an ordinary elderly civilian with no unusual history. But the X-rays told a very different story. Dr. Chen returned to Trauma Bay 3 with questions that seemed almost absurd to ask an elderly man who'd come in for a simple fall. Robert was sitting up in bed, looking exactly like what he appeared to be. A calm, ordinary grandfather waiting patiently for medical attention. "Mr. Martinez," Dr. Chen began carefully, "I need to ask you about some findings on your X-rays." Robert's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A wariness that hadn't been there before, like someone who'd suddenly realized they were being observed. "Doctor, before you ask whatever you're going to ask, let me save us both some time," Robert said quietly. "Yes, I know what you probably found. Yes, there are some old injuries that never got properly treated. And no, I didn't think they were relevant to falling downstairs." The casual way he dismissed what were obviously life-threatening injuries from his past struck Dr. Chen as remarkable. Most patients would be alarmed to learn they had bullet fragments in their bodies. Robert seemed almost annoyed that the subject had come up. "Mr. Martinez, these aren't just old injuries. You have 12 separate metallic foreign bodies in your skeletal system. Some of these appear to be bullet fragments from different weapons, different incidents. There's what looks like bomb shrapnel in your hip bone. These are serious combat injuries that should have killed you. What would you do if a patient looked you directly in the eyes and said what Robert said next? "Doctor, I'm 80 years old. Those injuries are from a long time ago, in places most people couldn't find on a map, doing things that officially never happened. They've been there for 50 years without causing problems. I'm here because I fell downstairs, not because of ancient history, that's supposed to stay buried. The casual way he dismissed what were obviously life-threatening injuries from multiple combat situations wasn't just remarkable. It was impossible. Unless this wasn't his first time having this conversation with medical professionals who'd stumbled onto his secrets. But Dr. Chen's medical training wouldn't let her dismiss the implications of what she was seeing. The pattern of injuries suggested someone who had been in multiple combat situations, who had survived things that should have been fatal, who had received battlefield medical treatment that was just good enough to keep him alive, but not sophisticated enough to remove all the foreign material. "Sir, some of these fragments are positioned near vital organs and major blood vessels. The fact that you survived these injuries, let alone lived with them for decades, is extraordinary." Robert's smile carried no humor, only a tired acknowledgement of facts that couldn't be changed. "Doctor, a lot of extraordinary things happened in those days. Most of us just tried not to think about them afterward." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Dr. Chen stepped out to find Tom Rodriguez, showing the X-ray images to Dr. James Patterson, the emergency department chief, who had apparently been called down to review the unusual case. "Sarah," Dr. Patterson said, "where did this patient come from? These injuries. I've only seen patterns like this in medical journals about combat casualties from Vietnam and Korea." "He's presenting as a simple fall victim," Dr. Chen replied, "but he's clearly had significant combat exposure. Multiple gunshot wounds, explosive trauma, and he's been living with these fragments for decades." Dr. Patterson studied the images more carefully. The bone remodeling patterns suggest these injuries occurred over an extended period, not in a single incident. This man saw repeated combat action. What neither doctor knew was that their conversation was being overheard by someone whose presence in the hospital that evening was purely coincidental. Retired Army Colonel Marcus Webb had brought his wife to the emergency room for what turned out to be a minor allergic reaction. He was waiting in the family area when he caught fragments of the medical discussion about combat injuries and X-ray findings. Colonel Webb's interest was piqued not just by the nature of the injuries being described, but by something else. The doctors mentioned the patient's name was Martinez, and they referenced a time frame that matched his own military service. There had been a Martinez in his unit during the final years of the Vietnam conflict, a medic who had earned a reputation for impossible rescues under fire. When Colonel Webb approached the medical staff and explained his potential connection to the patient, Dr. Chen found herself in the unusual position of facilitating what might be a military reunion in her emergency room. "If this is who I think it is," Colonel Webb said, "Robert Martinez was one of the most decorated medics in the 1st Cavalry Division. But his records were classified after he participated in cross-border operations that officially never happened." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the full picture remained hidden. Dr. Chen returned to Trauma Bay 3, this time accompanied by Colonel Webb, to find Robert staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. "Roberto," Colonel Webb said quietly, using a name that made Robert's head turn sharply. "Jesus Christ, it really is you." The recognition between the two men was immediate and complex. Colonel Webb stepped forward with the emotional weight of someone greeting a soldier he'd thought was dead. Robert's response was more guarded, the reaction of someone who had spent decades avoiding exactly this kind of recognition. "Marcus," Robert said simply, "I wondered when this day would come." "Roberto, we looked for you after Saigon fell. Your records disappeared. Personnel said you'd been transferred to a classified unit, then nothing. Half the division thought you'd been killed in Cambodia." Dr. Chen found herself witnessing a conversation that seemed to exist encoded references to events and places that had been deliberately erased from official history. The two men spoke of operations that had no names, casualties that weren't counted, and sacrifices that would never be acknowledged. The brass made it clear that certain things needed to stay buried, Robert explained. Some of us were given new identities, new lives, clean slates, as long as we stayed clean. Colonel Webb turned to Dr. Chen with an expression that mixed pride and sadness in equal measure. "Doctor, this man saved more lives than any combat medic in the history of the U.S. Army. He spent 2 years running medical evacuation operations in areas where American forces were never supposed to be. He walked into hell, repeatedly, to bring wounded soldiers home." The revelation recontextualized everything Dr. Chen had observed about Robert Martinez. His comfort in the medical environment, his precise responses to questions, his remarkable calm under stress. These weren't the characteristics of an ordinary elderly civilian. They were the traits of someone who had spent years making life and death decisions under the worst possible circumstances. "The metal fragments in your body," Dr. Chen said, understanding dawning in her voice. "You got those rescuing other soldiers." Robert's response was characteristically understated. Sometimes the enemy didn't appreciate our medical missions. But Colonel Webb provided the context that Robert would never volunteer himself. Roberto didn't just treat wounded soldiers. He ran solo rescue operations behind enemy lines. When other medics said a soldier couldn't be reached, Roberto found a way. He crawled through minefields, swam across rivers under fire, walked into active combat zones with nothing but a medical bag and his training. The story that emerged over the next hour painted a picture of courage that bordered on the impossible. Robert Martinez had been part of a classified medical unit that operated in the gray zones of the Vietnam conflict, areas where conventional forces couldn't go, where wounded soldiers would otherwise be abandoned, where the rules of engagement didn't apply, because officially no one was supposed to be there. "How many rescues?" Dr. Chen asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Confirmed?" Robert considered the question carefully. "Confirmed?" Robert considered the question carefully. 237 wounded soldiers brought out of areas where recovery was deemed impossible. The number landed in the trauma bay like a physical weight. Dr. Chen had treated hundreds of patients in her career, had saved dozens of lives, and considered herself a skilled physician. But the man sitting in her emergency room had saved more than 200 lives under conditions that defied imagination. "The fragments in your hip," Colonel Webb said, pointing to the X-ray still displayed on the viewing screen. "That's from the Mekong extraction, isn't it? When you went in after the downed helicopter crew." Robert nodded slowly, as if the memory required careful handling. 3 crew members. Pilot was alive but trapped. Co-pilot had a severed artery. I had maybe 20 minutes before they bled out, or the enemy found the crash site. "He carried all 3 out," Colonel Webb explained to Dr. Chen. "On foot, through 2 miles of jungle, while taking fire from multiple positions. The shrapnel in his hip happened during the extraction. He refused medical evacuation until all 3 crew members were stabilized." Dr. Chen was beginning to understand that the X-ray images told a story not just of survival, but of systematic self-sacrifice. Every metal fragment represented a moment when Robert had chosen to put himself in danger to save someone else's life. "Why was this never recognized officially?" she asked. The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither man wanted to explain directly. "Some wars have official parts and unofficial parts," Robert finally said. The unofficial parts require unofficial soldiers who officially never existed. Colonel Webb's expression grew darker. After the war ended, certain operations were classified beyond top secret. The soldiers who participated were given a choice: disappear into new identities with full benefits, or risk having their service records and their activities scrutinized by people who might not understand the context. "So you became Robert Martinez, retired civilian," Dr. Chen said, understanding the depth of the sacrifice involved. "I became Robert Martinez, who never served in the military, who never saw combat, who never saved anyone's life," Robert confirmed. It was easier than explaining things that couldn't be explained. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patterson, who had been conducting research based on the limited information available. What he had discovered added another layer to the mystery surrounding Robert Martinez. "Mr. Martinez," Dr. Patterson said, "I've been in contact with the Army Historical Division. They can't provide details, but they confirmed that there was indeed a classified medical unit operating in Southeast Asia during the time frame Colonel Webb mentioned. They also said that the casualties saved by that unit represent one of the highest success rates in combat medicine history." Robert's reaction to this official acknowledgement was complex. For 50 years, he had lived with the knowledge that his service would never be recognized, that the soldiers he had saved might never know his name, that the awards he had earned would never be presented. The sudden resurrection of his classified past was both vindicating and troubling. "Doctor," Robert said quietly, "I came here because I fell down some stairs. I didn't come here to be a case study or a war story." But Dr. Chen realized that the medical implications of Robert's history couldn't be ignored. The man had survived injuries that should have been fatal, had lived for decades with foreign objects in his body that would have killed most people, and had maintained remarkable physical and mental health despite a history of severe trauma. "Mr. Martinez, from a medical standpoint, you're extraordinary. The fact that you've lived 50 years with these injuries, maintained your mobility and cognitive function, and suffered no apparent complications is unprecedented." "Good genes and stubbornness," Robert replied, with the first genuine smile Dr. Chen had seen from him. Colonel Webb laughed, a sound that carried decades of shared history and mutual respect. "Roberto always said he was too mean to die. Turns out, he was right." As the evening progressed and Robert's immediate medical needs were addressed, his fall injuries were minor, requiring only pain medication and observation, a broader picture emerged of a man who had spent 5 decades hiding in plain sight. He had worked construction, raised a family that never knew his real history, and lived quietly in communities that saw him as nothing more than a friendly neighbor. "What did you tell your family?" Dr. Chen asked. "I told them I'd worked for the government in overseas positions, which was technically true. They didn't need to know the details. And when people thanked you for your service, I always said thank you and changed the subject. It seemed easier than explaining that my service never officially happened." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. A man who had devoted years of his life to saving others had spent decades unable to acknowledge that service, living with the knowledge that his sacrifices were classified, his heroism unrecognized, and his identity permanently altered for reasons of national security. As the night shift took over and Robert was cleared for discharge, his fall injuries were indeed minor, and the old combat wounds posed no immediate threat. Dr. Chen found herself reflecting on the hidden histories that walked through her emergency room every day. How many other patients carried stories they couldn't tell? How many ordinary-looking people harbored extraordinary pasts? "Mr. Martinez," she said as he prepared to leave. "I want you to know that what you did, even if it can't be officially recognized, matters. The soldiers you saved had families, children, grandchildren, who exist because of your courage." Robert's response was characteristically humble. "Doctor, I was just doing my job. The real heroes were the soldiers who kept fighting even when they were wounded." Colonel Webb disagreed. "Roberto, you were the guy who made sure those heroes made it home. That's a different kind of courage." As Robert Martinez walked out of St. Mary's Hospital that night, he looked exactly like what he appeared to be. An 80-year-old man recovering from a minor fall, returning to his quiet life in a small community where he was known as a helpful neighbor and nothing more. But the X-ray images that had revealed his secret remained in the hospital's files, a permanent record of service that could never be fully acknowledged. Dr. Chen kept copies of those images, not for medical purposes, but as a reminder that extraordinary stories often hide behind ordinary appearances. The man with 12 bullet fragments and bomb shrapnel in his skeleton had saved more than 200 lives in places that didn't exist, during operations that never happened, serving a country that could never thank him publicly. 3 days later, Robert Martinez was back to his normal routine: grocery shopping, maintaining his small garden, helping neighbors with minor repairs. The brief glimpse into his classified past had closed again, returning him to the anonymity he had maintained for 50 years. But word had a way of spreading in small communities, even when the details remained vague. Colonel Webb's visit to the hospital hadn't gone unnoticed, and questions began to circulate about the quiet elderly man who had apparently served in ways that couldn't be discussed openly. Robert handled the increased attention the same way he had handled everything else for 5 decades, with quiet dignity and a refusal to elaborate on details that weren't meant for public consumption. When neighbors asked about his military service, he acknowledged it briefly and changed the subject. When local veterans groups invited him to speak at events, he politely declined. The secret he had carried for 50 years remained largely intact, known now only to a small group of medical professionals and one old Army colonel who understood the importance of letting sleeping dogs lie. But for Dr. Chen, the case of Robert Martinez represented something profound about the nature of heroism and recognition. In a world where social media made everyone's accomplishments public, where service members were routinely celebrated and honored, there remained a group of people whose contributions could never be acknowledged, whose sacrifices would never be known, whose heroism was classified beyond the reach of public gratitude. 2 weeks after that Tuesday evening in October, Dr. Chen was treating another elderly patient, a routine case involving a man who had slipped in his bathroom, when something made her look more carefully at the X-rays. This patient, too, had old fragments embedded in his skeleton, and when she asked about military service, he gave the same evasive answers she had heard before. She began to wonder how many Robert Martinezes walked through her emergency room, carrying classified histories in their bones and buried memories in their hearts. How many ordinary-looking elderly patients harbored extraordinary pasts that would never be fully revealed. The answer, she realized, might be more than anyone imagined. Robert Martinez returned to his quiet life, his secret safe again, his service record sealed in files that would never be declassified. He continued to be exactly what he appeared to be: a helpful neighbor, a kind elderly man, someone who lived quietly and asked for nothing more than to be left alone. But now, when he walked through his community, there were a few people who knew to look beyond the surface, who understood that the most powerful stories are often the ones that can never be told, and that true heroes don't always wear uniforms or receive medals. They sometimes wear ordinary clothes, live ordinary lives, and carry extraordinary secrets that will die with them, taking with them the knowledge of lives saved, sacrifices made, and courage displayed in places that officially never existed. So I ask you, have you ever wondered about the hidden histories of the people around you? Have you met someone whose quiet demeanor suggested depths you couldn't fathom? Someone who carried themselves with a particular kind of strength that hinted at experiences beyond the ordinary? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about the ordinary people you've known who might have harbored extraordinary pasts. Because, at Untold Legends Stories, we believe that the most powerful narratives are often the ones hiding in plain sight, carried by people who chose silence over recognition, service over glory. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those whose stories can never be fully told. We share a new tale of hidden valor every day. And remember, the next time you see someone others overlook, look closer. You might be standing next to a legend who officially never existed.